So beginning chapter 5 in your textbook, we are looking at, in this section, infancy and cognitive development. And we're going to take a look at part 1 first. Now remember, the last chapter also covered infancy, but we looked at physical development. This time, we're going to take a look at the cognitive development in infants. And remember, when we're talking cognitive development, we're talking about the things that go into thinking, memory, language, problem solving, those kinds of things. So part 1 in chapter 5 discusses Jean Piaget's contributions to cognitive development. He is probably the leading researcher, theorist in this area in cognitive development, not only in infancy, but later on in life too. And one of my favorite quotes from Jean Piaget, is the idea here that play is the work of childhood. Okay, so there's Mr. Piaget. In his later years, I love this picture of him. He was a Swiss psychologist, and Piaget was hypothesized, that cognitive processes develop in an orderly fashion. All right, he focused on what we call perception and mental representations. All right, so how we perceive the world and how we represent the world. And again, he hypothesized that we develop these skills in sort of an orderly sequence of events or stages. So he labeled 4 stages: the sensorimotor stage, which is what we're going to primarily talk about in this chapter. And this is sensorimotor stage is the first 2 years of life, the first 2 years of cognitive development. All right. Later on, we're going to talk about the pre-operational stage, which is more toddlerhood. Concrete operational, which is more childhood, elementary school, and then formal operational, kind of middle school, high school, and beyond. All right, so let's look at the sensorimotor stage, though, in this chapter. All right, now Piaget's sensorimotor stage is divided into 6 substages, okay? Each substage, again, covers the first 2 years of development, and each stage, infants are progressing to some sort of goal-oriented behavior. Maybe some earlier forms of behavior are repeated, maybe varied, maybe coordinated with new behaviors. We go from just very reflexive behavior to definitely goal-oriented behavior. So let's look at the substages. Now, if you're following along in your textbook, I am on page 97. All right, so substage 1, this is what your book refers to as simple reflexes. This is the first month after birth. And basically, we are just responding to the world through those reflexes that we're born with. So remember we talked about those reflexive behaviors that we find in infants, like the Babinski and the Morrow, and sucking and grasping. All of those things we use to respond to the world around us, to respond to stimuli around us. They just happen reflexively. We don't have to think about them. They just happen. Now, as we get a little bit older, even within the first few hours of life, we start to modify these reflexes, these actions, these behaviors. Your book talks about, for example, we begin to adapt our sucking based on the shape of the nipple and the rate of flow of the fluid. So we even adjust how we suck on something based on our experience with the environment, even just a few hours after birth. And that happens, for about the first month of life, just very dominated by those reflexive behaviors. Substage 2 begins at about 1 to 4 months, and these are called primary circular reactions. Now, your book defines primary circular reactions as a repetition of an action that first just occurs by chance and that focuses on our own bodies. All right, so for instance, we might by chance grab onto something because we know infants can grasp onto things. And that first off may happen by chance. Later on, we may start grabbing at things intentionally. Now, we may not be successful necessarily, but the grasping at objects becomes intentional, not just voluntary, not just happen to grasp onto something simply because it's in our hand. So these primary circular reactions are some of the first things, the first behaviors that we start to see where there is some goal-oriented behavior. There's some voluntary behavior. All right, moving on. Substages 3 and 4. Substage 3, we talk about secondary circular reactions, and this is 4 to 8 months. Now, these are repetitions of an action that produce an effect on the environment. All right. So in the first, that substage 2, that primary circular reactions, remember, infants are focused on their own body. In this substage, they're focused to environmental kinds of things. So your book talks about our ability to learn how to pull strings to make a plastic face appear, the ability to shake a rattle in order to hear the noise it makes. So now we're just not focused on what our own body can do, but what we can do with our body to affect the world around us. Substage 4 talks about the coordination of secondary schemes. And now this lasts from about ages 8 to 12 months. We're getting a little bit older. This is intentional, goal-directed behavior, right? And so we're coordinating our behavior to attain specific goals. We're intentional and differentiate between how to achieve the goal and actually achieving the goal itself. For example, like your book talks about, you can lift a piece of cloth in order to get to a toy that is hidden. So we're actually picking up the cloth, and that's coordinated with an effort, the end goal to reach that toy. All right. So we know that the infant has mentally represented that that toy is there, and then is making an effort with their body, with the environment, to change that to actually reach the toy. We gain the capacity at this point to imitate gestures. When we start to learn how to clap, those sorts of things, maybe even sounds. We're starting to learn how to talk, so we're imitating things in our environment, movements and sounds that maybe we hadn't noticed before or that were ignored before. We're starting to be able to imitate people. All right, since the substages 5 and 6, substage 5 is labeled tertiary circular reactions, and now this is 12 to 18 months. And this is what Piaget talked about, establishing ideas to new situations through trial and error. All right. And what do I mean by that? Okay. Well, our behavior takes on a new sort of experimental quality. We may try a couple times or many times to figure out how something works. Now, your book has a great example talking about Piaget's daughter, Jacqueline, because Piaget used his own kids a lot and observations of his own kids to develop these ideas. So Piaget placed a stick outside Jacqueline's playpen that had wooden bars. So Jacqueline grasped at the stick and tried to pull it sideways through the playpen. Now, of course, it wasn't going to come because it had those, it had the wooden bars, so the stick was just going to bump up against it, and she wasn't going to be able to get it in that way. Stick was too long, couldn't fit through the bars. So she tried over and over and over to get that stick into the playpen. Eventually, she learned if she turned the stick upright, parallel with the wooden bars on her playpen, she could fit it through the space between the bars. So tertiary circular reactions. We're adapting our behavior to new, or we're adapting how to do things, our knowledge of the world, to new situations, and often through trial and error. And then lastly, in the sensory motor period, the last substage, inventions of new means through mental combinations, right? Excuse me, this is 18 to 24 months. So late infancy, early infancy, kind of toddlerhood, early toddlerhood um, kind of time. And this is where we're using mental trial and error. So not necessarily physical trial and error, but mental trial and error. Again, Piaget talked about looking at his other children, Lucien and Laurent. And so instead of trying to solve a problem physically, where they try over and over and over, they seem to set and contemplate the problem. So he gave them the same stick and the playpen problem. Now they were a little bit older. They were both 18 months old. And at the time, they didn't, when they were presented with this problem, they didn't try over and over and over to move that stick through the playpen bars. Instead, they sat and thought, would appear to think about it for a minute, grasped that stick, turned it upright, and moved it through the bars. So they were able to mentally represent that stick along with the bars of the playpen to see how they would fit together and how that stick would fit through the bars. They didn't have to do it physically to see it. They were able to do it mentally, to mentally represent that. And that demonstrates what Piaget called symbolic thought. All right. And with symbolic thought comes one of the hallmarks of this stage, the development of object permanence. Now, object permanence is the realization that an object or a person exists even when that person is out of sight. Now, neonates, newborns, don't have this ability, which is why Peekaboo works so well. If you are behind your hands and then suddenly reappear and the infant seems genuinely baffled, excited, happy to see you, that's because they are. Because behind your hands, when you're not there, you don't exist. Kind of out of sight, out of mind. Eventually, infants begin to realize as they get a little bit older, just because they can't see something doesn't mean it's not there. Now, occasionally, kids who have developed this ability will show what's called A, not B error. Well, they will look in the same place where something has been, even though they know that the object has been hidden in a new place. Now, that doesn't happen very often, but occasionally this will, particularly if there's a delay between the time you show them where it is and the time you ask them to look for it. Now, I'll show you some video later in our course resources of object permanence, but here you see two children. The top one has not developed object permanence. She is not looking for that blue monkey. All right, she sees it. It's hidden behind the board. It doesn't matter. She doesn't seem to know that it's behind the board. But the little guy in the black and white photos, I'm not sure what that is. Looks kind of like an egg timer or a sand timer. He sees it, it's put behind the blanket, and he goes for it. He moves that blanket, that sheet out of the way, and there is that timer. Now, some evaluation of Piaget's theory. It is a comprehensive model of infant cognition. Okay, it's super comprehensive. Piaget, one of the problems with Piaget's idea is that development isn't tied to discrete stages like Piaget claimed. It's a discontinuous process. It happens in fits and starts. All right. He emphasized the role of physical maturation, almost to the exclusion of the influence of peers and parents. So our peers and our parents have and caretakers have a huge influence on how we learn and what we learn in those first couple years. And then lastly, the appearance of deferred imitation. Now, Piaget said this didn't appear until about 18 months. And this is when we start to begin to imitate people and events that have occurred in the past. Piaget said that didn't start to develop till about 18 months. Some studies show that it actually can happen as early as 9 months, especially if there's repetition or the ability to be exposed to that stimulation on a regular basis.